The other day, I was talking with a pastor from the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church. And this is a denomination that's been around. I believe it was founded in the 1880s, very large Protestant denomination, evangelical, broadly evangelical. And he's ministered in this denomination for decades. But he also has lingering concerns about doctrinal one doctrinal element in particular in the statement of faith for the alliance. And I thought this was an interesting case study because a lot of people have similar issues with an aspect of a confessional statement or statement of belief of a particular denomination, and they're wondering, how can I be a part of this denomination when I have a question or a doubt, or I actually disbelieve, as in the case of this pastor I was talking to. I disbelieve this particular doctrinal confessional element. And that's a great question. The first thing that you want to consider is, what is the functional role of this statement? Is this statement a boundary statement? Does it function as a boundary statement within your community of faith, such that denial of any one element of the statement is sufficient to place one outside of the belief community altogether? Or is it rather more of a centering document, which allows for the possibility of in conscience interpretation and disagreement and application of the statement? So you could reject some particular element of the statement and still be part of the community. And the reality is that often this is very complex because sometimes I suspect what is more often the case is that statements are a mixture, so that they are in some respects boundary statements and in some respects centering statements. There are things that are essential in there, and then there are things that are not essential. And you maybe don't know until you actually begin to question and have the freedom to have that conversation. I think about a friend of mine who is a Presbyterian, and years ago he went to teach at a Presbyterian university. And part of the hiring process was that he had to provide a response to the Westminster Confession of Faith. So, does he agree with the Westminster Confession of Faith? And a part of his response was to say, well, there are some elements I don't agree with. For example, a reference to the Pope being the Antichrist. Well, was fair. That was an example where this is a centering document rather than a boundary document. That he could reject a confession in the Pope being the Antichrist and still be part of this community, because on that respect, this wasn't a boundary statement, but rather a centering one. But I guarantee there are other aspects of the Westminster Confession of Faith that one cannot reject and still be a member of that Christian university, like a full faculty of that Christian university. And so I think often you'll find that's the ambiguity, because typically when you look at these statements, they don't tell you this is boundary stuff, this is centering stuff. You can you have to agree with this, you can disagree with this, or you can qualify this. And so it's very tough for often for Christians, Christian leaders, people who want to become members and so on, or to be employed by a particular organization, that when they have a statement of belief and they're not sure what they can agree and disagree with, what do you do in those situations? Okay, so that brings us anyway, that's sort of preliminary. That brings us back to the CMA statement of faith. The issue that this pastor was disagreeing with was eternal conscious torment. Interestingly, so I looked at the statement, and eternal conscious torment is mentioned not in the little confessional statement on eschatology, but rather on sin, interestingly. So, what I want to do is to take a look at the statement and what it says. And here's the thing that I wanted to suggest to this pastor. So, we're now segueing from boundary versus centering conversations to another conversation. And that other conversation is this: to point out that statements of faith are always interpreted by a reader. And so you have the statement of faith, but then you have the interpretation of the reader. And very often people perceive incompatibility between their self-understanding of doctrine and a statement of faith because they bring to the statement of faith an interpretation. They assume that interpretation. They don't pause to question that interpretation. And that was the case with this pastor. He was perceiving an incompatibility between his own perspective and the statement of faith because of his interpretation of the statement of faith. And I wanted at least to raise a question. Could it be that you're assuming an interpretation of the statement of faith and that there are other possible interpretations that are consistent with your reservations about or rejection of eternal conscious torment? And this is a lesson for each one of us when we're interpreting and reading statements of faith. Are we assuming an interpretation that gives rise to the conflict? So I think it's best for me to give the example to unpack and explain what I'm talking about. So, as I said, there's a section on sin, and it says this: the destiny of the impenitent and unbelieving is existence forever in conscious torment. And by contrast, the believer's existence is everlasting joy and bliss. So, if you have to believe as a pastor, if your beloved child is ultimately impenitent and unbelieving, then their future is eternal conscious torment while you exist in joy and bliss. And this pastor doesn't believe that. He has a different view of posthumous judgment. I didn't explore what his view is, but it's not this. This just seems wrong to him. And so he's in that difficult space of having a statement of faith where I think, certainly his assumption is that this is a boundary rather than a centering statement, and such that if he were more vocal about his objections or concerns, that would be sufficient for him no longer to be considered in good standing a minister within the denomination. That creates a problem for him. Here's the other statement. So it refers to the unjust in the eschatology section, the unjust having a resurrection unto judgment. So you put it together, here's what you seem to get. You have the destiny of two different groups of people, and you are committed to believing in order to adhere to this statement of faith insofar as it's a boundary statement that there is a group called the unjust who will be resurrected to judgment. They are also impenitent and unbelieving, and that judgment consists of eternal conscious torment. And I can see how a person could have a problem with that. One quick sidebar. Time and again, when I talk about this view of hell, I emphasize, and I think it's so critical to emphasize, that eternal conscious torment, so this is a punishment, right? It is a judgment right there. It is a punishment. The punishment consists of God inflicting either through God's own action and or God giving people over to the consequences of their own choices. Either way, it is God subjecting them to a judgment, to a punishment that consists of eternal conscious torment. Here's the key. To punish somebody by inflicting torment upon them, whether it is through you appropriating their own self-inflicted torment or you actively tormenting them, either way, what that is torture. So at the heart of this view of posthumous judgment is that God inflicts eternal torture on people. I can understand why this pastor is repelled by this element of the statement of faith from the alliance. And this is not to pick on the alliance. This is common, right, across many denominations. Certainly, by one interpretation of the denomination I'm a part of, the North American Baptist, you have a similar kind of commitment. But here is where I wanted to say, okay, yeah, you could have the question, is this a boundary versus a centering statement? He believes it's a boundary statement. But the issue that I wanted to focus on was to say, are you interpreting something that maybe creates the conflict that may not, in fact, be entailed by what you're reading? In other words, is there another way to read what this obliges you to believe? And I said, here's an alternative scenario. I said, does the statement, so before I looked at the statement, I asked the pastor, does the statement say that there are people who are eternally subjected to this torment. And he said, well, maybe, I don't know. I guess maybe not. Here's the issue. Here's the question. So what this statement could be interpreted as is this, and this is the interpretation that he didn't consider, but I think he should, is that this could be a counterfactual statement. In other words, it says the in the case that there is a group who are ultimately impenitent and unbelieving, that group will experience eternal conscious torment. It doesn't follow that there is such a group. It only says if there is to be such a group, this is what will happen to them. They will suffer eternal torment. But maybe there is not such a group. And what that means is that this is consistent with being a universalist. Because one could believe, in fact, all will be saved. There ultimately will be nobody who is impenitent and unbelieving in the end. And all will experience everlasting joy and bliss. All you're committed to saying is counterfactually, were there to be some who were impenitent and unbelieving, then they would experience torment. But in fact, one need not believe any will experience torment. But what this pastor assumes when he reads this, and what so many people would assume, is that, well, we know that there are going to be such people who are impenitent and unbelieving, and this doesn't say that there will be. So there may be none that ultimately are impenitent and unbelieving. So interestingly, if you just look at this passage, um, then you have, oh, sorry, buddy. So I just kicked my dog inadvertently. But if you look at this passage, then what you have is the possibility it's consistent with universalism. Now, you might be wondering, yeah, but it talks about a group that are resurrected under judgment. Here's a second assumption that we have to be careful about. So the second statement refers to a group called the unjust. The first one refers to a group called the impenitent and unbelieving. Now, yes, a reader might well assume that the unjust is just the same group as the impenitent and unbelieving, but maybe not. Maybe the unjust are the people who are impenitent and unbelieving at the time of death, who need to undergo a judgment which ultimately is restorative. It restores them to God in Christ. So that um, in the eschatology section, the judgment is not a judgment of eternal conscious torment. It is a judgment of restoration, which removes the need for eternal conscious torment, because ultimately all of the unjust become penitent and believing. You could interpret this passage like that. Now, I know some people are going to say, yeah, but that's not what they really mean. Here you're into a really interesting question. And I think the analogy here that is very interesting is the analogy in with interpreting the US Constitution, because you hear about it a lot there. You have two different basic philosophical approaches to interpreting the Constitution. The originalist interpretation says we should interpret the Constitution in accord with, delimited by the original intentions of the original writers of the Constitution. They fix the range of possible meaning for us. And then there is a living interpretation of the Constitution, which says we interpret the Constitution for our own time and age, and we are not delimited by the interpretations and intentions, or the meaning and intentions of the original writers. Uh, and you can bring that same distinction to any statement of belief you're going to encounter. In other words, is the statement of belief, is the range of what is actually meant by these passages, is it limited by the original writers of the CMA statement of faith, or is it up to each individual and communities to interpret for themselves what this means and how it applies to them? I like to give the example, which I'm more familiar with. I mentioned I'm part of the North American Baptist denomination. I'd say I'm on the fringes of it, but I'm part of it. And so their statement of belief was written in 1982 in Niagara Falls. And so I would often, when I was a professor, would present this to my students to consider. Like, let's say you're NAB. Should you have an originalist interpretation of this statement of belief so that the meaning of what you are assenting to is fixed by the intent of the original writers of the statement back in 1982? Or is there a living approach that is viable so that you can interpret it for yourself, individually and collectively within your own church and in your own time? And you're not limited by what the original writers meant in 1982. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, of course, the originalists, yeah, you have to go back to what they meant. But then you have another question. Okay, how do we know what exactly they meant? They gave us the statement. Did they give us reader's notes to interpret the statement, to explain exactly what they meant by every confessional statement? And did every individual who signed onto the statement share that same interpretation? How many of them could have disagreed with a particular interpretation back in the original writing of it to allow for there to be possible variant interpretations based upon the original intent, which wasn't universal at the time? This is actually a lot more complicated than people recognize. So, same thing here with this CMA statement when it talks about the impenitent and unbelieving, conscious torment, the unjust, resurrection unto judgment. Do we know what all of the original writers meant by these? Did they tell us how to interpret them? Uh, so there's the question then, first of all, should you be an originalist about this statement? And second of all, if you are, how do you figure out what the original meaning and possible range of interpretation is? Again, these are not simple questions. This is not to settle the issue. This is to say that simply reading and assuming a particular interpretation and assuming that it is a boundary statement is to assume a lot. Maybe it isn't. And maybe the conflict and tension that you are sensing within your confessional tradition is not, maybe it's manufactured by your assumptions and maybe the assumptions of some other people around you. And maybe it's worthwhile challenging those assumptions. And if a lot of people have those assumptions, maybe challenge their assumptions as well, uh, so that we could begin to have communities that are a little freer in terms of their exploration of what they believe individually and collectively. And you don't have to police the thought of other people so that they feel compelled to share their concerns and reservations and disagreements quietly with an individual confidant, but not be able to have a conversation about them out in public, which I think is a tragedy.